Lennert Van Hauwermeiren, welcome to the Based podcast. Could you kindly introduce yourself? Who is Lennert Van Hauwermeiren?
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much to have me here. I'm a student of philosophy. I've graduated in 2023 during the COVID pandemic and studied philosophy at the University of Ghent. Afterwards, while I was studying, I became involved in KVHV, that's a traditionalist fraternity. After my studies, I became involved in politics. I became involved in with the Vlaams Belang Party. Now I'm also founding my own publishing house.
I think we're both, let's say, situated on the right side of the political spectrum. I think we can say that. But I'm 60 or 25, so we grew up in a completely different setting. So inevitably, that will change the way we look at conservatism, at the right, at politics, at life in general. You are a generation who grew up with a smartphone in their pocket. When I was a very young age, there was no mobile phone, no internet, no nothing. So the growing up under radically different circumstances must have completely changed it's quite a different circumstance. Now, what I find amazing is that we can still find people like you who are on the right and who are very, very eloquent on the right, whereas let's say the education field has been completely hijacked by the left and by the progressives. So maybe that's the first thing that I'm a bit curious about, honestly. Are there many people like you who are young and who can still identify as the right? And was it easy or difficult for you throughout your education to form this kind of thoughts? Because I think we can say that the education field is largely biased to the left.
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's quite clear, but it's also there are also studies done about it in Flanders and elsewhere too, that a lot of people from my generation, from Gen Z, are quite disillusioned with old political systems. So there is a large percentage who just don't want to do politics, who are just have this. It's also a kind of learned helplessness, to be honest. It's like they don't believe they can change anything, and so a lot of young people are, in my opinion, disillusioned in how politics is going, and so that's how you get many of these homeless left wing, what we call homeless progressives or homeless liberals that would want to vote on a classical liberal party, but they just see that their party doesn't represent them. The same with progressive, with leftists. A lot of disillusioned homeless leftists who want to vote for left-wing parties, but they also see that the left has changed. And also in the right wing, I think there are a lot of young people who understand that conservatism, as it has been wielded the last 40 to 60 years, that there are a few problems with it, mainly, and this is what we could call the identitarian critique, is that the idea that preserving old institutions, for example, the church, for example, the monarchy in England, that these old institutions, why do we have to preserve them if they don't serve the concrete people, if they don't serve the British people themselves, if they don't serve the Flemish people themselves? So this is a big problem within conservatism, is that they want to conserve structures that don't seem to work anymore. So yeah, there is on the right, I think, also disillusionment in the youth, and that's how the alternative right, the alt-right in 2015-16, they tried to give an alternative vision to mainstream right-wing politics. I would argue that today most of the youth are more interested in these kind of politics instead of this kind of more classical interpretation of right-wing politics. And then for the second question, like in education, I mean, education is really the humanities have been completely eroded. It's not even about competence anymore. Like it's not like first it was like the competence level was going down, but now it's just full on a branch of the establishment. It's really all the people who can get a professorship are handpicked by the by left wing and progressive professors. So it's a completely self-perpetuating system. At this point, it's going to be quite hard to build something new. That's why we try to make more YouTube videos about these educational purposes. Why we want to make our own editing houses, because the old universities, they aren't providing these points of view.
Let's say more or less happy to see that people with your conviction can still flourish in the university field in Belgium, more specifically in the University of Ghent. Because how difficult was it for you to get your master philosophy degree, having this type of conviction, which I think goes against, let's say, the majority of the university and the academic field that was surrounding you?
So in my first years, I wasn't really interested in politics, actually. When I started philosophy, I also went to the University of Ghent because I was very much interested in logic and philosophy of science. This was my main research field. We had a few quarrels, but it's the classical story that the left has to politicize everything, and they are quite smart in this. Actually, this is how they win the culture wars: is by forcing you to make a choice, forcing you to choose a side. And this happened at my faculty in Ghent too. It was a very politicized faculty. Most of my professors were Marxists, some openly, some less openly. They kind of pushed normal students like me who weren't specifically politicized. They kind of forced us to make a choice, and that's how I got more interested into the entire topic of politics. So. And that's how in my third year, I also joined the traditional fraternity, KVHV Ghent. To answer your question about how hard it was to get a degree, I wrote my master's thesis about Oswald Spengler. He's a quite notorious German conservative revolutionary philosopher. I had to censor myself in many cases to just to obtain a good to have a good promoter. So just to be able to write the thesis, you have to make clear that you won't go into some conclusions that they are drawing these thinkers.
Having said that, are you still behind, let's say, the final work that you delivered, or do you feel that it's been too much of a compromise in order to get your degree?
I made a compromise, certainly, by actually linking this conservative revolutionary philosophy to the interpretation of a very known author in Germany called Thomas Mann. And Thomas Mann is he's accredited, acclaimed by everyone to be a good writer. So he's not controversial in any sense, but he had a conservative revolutionary phase before 1926. He was part of this conservative revolution, where Oswald Spengler was one of the main proponents of too. And so I linked this philosophy of Oswald Spengler to Thomas Mann's or to the interpretation of the works of Thomas Mann, to give a more to use this philosophy to explain the changes in Mann's thinking.
One final thing about the introduction. You mentioned that this new alt-right section within the right is critical of institutions, which I can sort of fathom, but also of religion. And that to me was quite surprising to hear, because I thought that family, religion, the nation was kind of the common foundation within the right. So if you're going to attack religion as an institution, to me, that's quite surprising. Could you elaborate a bit on that point?
I wouldn't say that the alt-right per se is skeptical of religion, because they are skeptical of modernity itself, and modernity is the secularization and the beginning of atheism and so on. So I think there is a place for religion, but it is the institutionalized religion which I think they are skeptical of. So the church,
not religion, yeah.
Yeah, the institutions which are behind religion. It's not only the church; yes. It's also it's like how religion is brought at schools. Even in the traditional Catholic scene, they are also quite skeptical about how the church is organized today. So I wouldn't
Absolutely.
say it's a skepticism against religion itself. I think there is a lot of search for meaning within these new kind of alternative right-wing spheres. But I would argue that there is a lot of skepticism towards how the institutions of religion have conformed to liberal progressive thinking.
Lennert, the reason for having you on was that I thought it was interesting to discuss a speech given by our current Prime Minister, who is also the president of the biggest political party in Belgium by a very small margin. They are the biggest. They see themselves as center-right. In that speech, he sort of identifies himself as a liberal conservative, and he calls his brand of conservatism enlightened conservatism, which to me sounds a bit like an oxymoron, because it's for me to have these two things under the same umbrella is first of all surprising, but also I think it doesn't work, because from the experience that I see, I think his party, N-VA, Bart De Wever, you could draw a very large comparison with other center-right parties in Europe and in the West, like the Tories, like many other different political groups, who identify as conservative, but who, after the elections, they are conservative before the elections in order to persuade the people. And once elected, they govern on the left. And they sort of fall in line with global institutions, and they obey to the global market, which is a completely different kind of conservatism than the national conservatives, who think that these global markets and these central banks should actually listen to the people and not the other way around. So could you kindly elaborate on that, on these definitions of liberal conservative, national conservative, and how you see this?
I think that Prime Minister De Wever, in his speech, was really showing that he's a proponent of what I would call neoconservatism. And it was quite clear he was making references to Thatcher, was making references to Reagan,
Absolutely.
for example, to Helmut Kohl. And I would call this kind of brand of conservatism neoconservatism, because Reagan said for the first time, I believe it was in 1983, that he said, like, I didn't leave the Democrat Party left me. And this is actually the main kind of idea of neoconservatism, is actually that people who are disillusioned with left-wing politics, who seem to understand that it didn't work out how they wanted it to work out, that they suddenly find themselves on the right. Another very good example of this is in the 2000s. I guess you will remember this better than me. There was this wave of new atheism. You had the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, with Dawkins, for example. And these new atheists, they were the hardest enemies of everyone more right wing than them. They were always the guys who had the biggest critique on Christians who were more right wing than them, for example. But now they find themselves at the camp of the white male, the camp of the new right wing, because the left always goes farther and farther left. So they wanted to be liberals in the 2000s, and now they find themselves at the other side of the fence. And so this is what I would call the neoconservative cycle. The left will always go more and more left because they don't have enemies to the left. It's literally a principle in left-wing politics: no enemies to the left. While the right will always, people who are closest to the right will always critique everyone who's more right-wing than them. And so what you see is this cycle of liberals becoming conservatives who are disillusioned with the left, always with the revolution eating its own children, actually.
Well, what I
So
find
yeah,
amazing that in this speech, which I will link in the show notes below, it's a speech for the International Democracy Union or something of the like, which was founded in the times of Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl, indeed. But what I found really baffling is that Prime Minister Bart De Wever gives a very harsh critique of the progressives. During this speech, he says that they are advocating for a Gotterdammerung. He's really quite outspoken, exposing the flaws in their ideology. But then, once the elections have passed, he has no qualms whatsoever in making a coalition with them, rather than with the National Conservatives on the right, who are ideologically, on paper, much
absolutely.
more aligned with his views. So to me, that is utterly baffling that they would rather die than form an alliance. And this is also
Yeah.
true, I think, across the West, that these so-called center-right or liberal conservatives, they are only conservative before the election, and after the election, they are liberal progressives. They are indeed capable of making profound analysis of what is wrong with progressives, but once the elections have passed, they have no problem whatsoever in making a coalition with them. So how do you see
Yeah,
that?
I think we're past the discussion about whether it's incompetence or malice. We're not going to go into this discussion now. Whether these people are just incompetent or they do it on purpose and they want to betray their voters on purpose. But I would argue that there is a fundamental misunderstanding about the presuppositions in which they operate. So they can't give a fundamental critique to the left or to progressivism. He literally doesn't. Also in the speech, he doesn't critique it fundamentally. He literally says that the excesses of the progressive worldview, what the progressive worldview has become, this is the thing he is critiquing. So, for example, what you said too in his speech, he talks about the self-denial of the left, the postmodern madness, the hostility to innovation, the rejection of prosperity, the woke nonsense. He sees these as a kind of deviation of what the left had to be. He thinks that progressivism could have worked, but it has deviated. He also literally says in his speech, there has been a Copernican shift. There occurred a Copernican shift in the progressive movement. So he believes that the consequences of the liberal progressive worldview are not tied to the assumptions of the worldview itself. He believes that you can have the liberal progressive assumptions of modernity, of the Enlightenment, for example, without the consequences of self-denial, postmodernism, hostility to innovation, and so on and so on.
In the speech, he literally says the conservative train has well arrived at the station of enlightened modernism and belief in progress. So he says that the conservative train has arrived at the station of enlightened modernism.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, he believes he also says the legacy of modernism is now on us. So the conservatives are the real modernists now. And they can take the principles of modernism further without going off in these wrong ways of everything he lists there, the postmodern madness and so on, which he refuses to say what it means concretely. It means concretely the dissolution of the family. It means concretely that there is more immigration. It means concretely that your children are going to have transgender nonsense in school. He will never say these concrete the concrete instances of postmodern madness, of self-denial. For example, self-denial, he doesn't say concretely that it means that we should revere our heroes, we should revere our history, for example. He doesn't really say that.
What amazes me, for example, in Ghent, one of the major towns where there was a competition for his party to join the local council, the first thing his candidate did was sign a declaration whereby they agree, how do you call it, decolonization in Ghent. Decolonization which is like a fighting principle of the radical progressive left. So they have no problem signing on to that in Ghent. Bart De Wever himself has no problem posing in rainbow socks on the day of the Pride Parade, and his party is actually joining the Pride Parade. So I find it's also almost schizophrenic. He's making this huge and eloquent argument against all the excesses of dystopian progressivism, but after the election, he has no problem whatsoever in joining, in hopping on this bandwagon. So to me, it's like, what's happening here?
But he can't, because he's not able to critique the assumptions. He's not able to critique the assumptions of the liberal progressive worldview and anthropology. The philosophical anthropology of liberalism is that people can just do whatever they want, that everything is a market, and if he would refuse, for example, to participate in the Pride March, he would have to justify this in a certain sense, but it's not possible because he believes too in these liberal assumptions. So if you can't critique the liberal assumptions about, for example, universality of human nature, that everyone is just replaceable with one another, and so on, you won't ever be in practice. You won't be able to do something else than woke nonsense. You won't in practice be able to have not immigrants, because the courts of human rights, for example, will say, but you're betraying your liberal principles. So as long as you don't critique the liberal progressive assumptions, you will always be forced to operate within that framework. And there are only a few logical consequences of that, and that is more LGBTQ, more immigration, and so on. It works actually like a ratchet. You can only go one way, but not the other, because you're already kind of accepted that the other way isn't possible in your assumptions. You see, so it only can go one way, and he quite clearly, he knows that this is the case. He's quite clear about that he's also just a train following the so-called progressive train, but just a bit slower. And this is what also one of the things I wanted to discuss, is that he works within this framework where the left and the right are fundamentally working towards the same society.
It's the same.
They are fundamentally
liberal worldview.
So because they work within the liberal progressive assumptions, but they disagree on how they should be implemented. They are still working on the same society, and this is the essence of controlled opposition.
He says, I quote, "Enlightened conservatism is the best response to the challenges of our time." Okay, but then when you look at the practice, he's just mimicking the whole progressive extreme left view. So on the one hand, he says, our view is the best response to the challenges of our time, but he is unable to translate this in any way, shape, or form in practical political terms. And then he goes on to say that the alternatives are the roads that lead to dictatorship or to a Hobbesian worldview where everyone is at war with everyone. Okay? But two things, the road to dictatorship, but then he supports Ursula von der Leyen with his party as for another term as president of the European Union. I think if there's one road leading to dictatorship, it's this one. So he's supporting Ursula von der Leyen, who is trying to roll out the central bank digital currency, who's trying to introduce even more regulation, even more Orwellian, dystopian centralized control. The EU is fast on the way to become the EU SSR. They are
Huxleyan.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Mm.
It's Huxleyan, absolutely, more than Orwellian. A good remark. But it looks more and more like a Chinese version of a European version of the Chinese system, which he is facilitating with his party. But then in this speech, he's critiquing that the alternative to enlightened conservatism would lead to dictatorship. It makes no sense.
So yeah. So first of all, the reason why I interjected with like Huxleyan dictatorship is because Huxleyan dictatorship can work within the liberal framework. The kind of dictatorship that the EU is proposing is a liberal kind of tyranny. It's a liberal way of tyrannizing people. I would argue. And so what Bart De Wever is saying here, like the only alternatives are the Hobbesian kind of bellum omnia contra omnes or dictatorship. First of all, I would argue that the state where we are in is becoming more and more Hobbesian. I think it is his kind of liberal assumptions that are creating a Hobbesian worldview where there is no centralization of what Hobbes would call the centralization of violence. I think that's going away. And then secondly, everything which is and it's against this kind of these liberal assumptions about humanity is for him authoritarian. And this plays into a very leftist narrative, and it's in the 30s. In the 30s, the Frankfurter Schule wrote a book. I think it was Adorno who wrote a book, The Authoritarian Personality. And basically, it says everyone who believes in God, everyone who believes in something bigger than himself, is potentially fascist, is potentially authoritarian. Everyone who believes in loyalty or in a higher purpose is potentially fascist, potentially authoritarian. Everyone who believes in community and ethnic and cultural ties is potentially authoritarian. And so he plays into this really Marxist worldview of everything which isn't just atomized individuals are authoritarian and is dictatorship for him. So he can't imagine a right-wing society in which there are cultural bonds, in which there is loyalty to the state, to the community, and so on, without falling into this trap of the authoritarian personality. This quote that he says, like, it's either the Hobbesian worldview or dictatorship, I think he's slipping into the Hobbesian worldview very fast. I think his society is slipping into the Hobbesian worldview very fast. And I would argue that the alternative to what he is proposing isn't per se a dictatorship, but it's a reversion back to more like loyalties which are higher than the individual itself, which are higher than this atomized liberal worldview. So yeah, I mean, I think it's also completely contradictory, and I think also that this kind of ideology is in a vacuum. It doesn't have any concrete substance. He himself falls within this dichotomy between Hobbesian or so-called dictatorship.
Yeah, he ends by saying that let us embrace the Enlightenment. So for him, the Enlightenment is the be-all and end-all as conservatives, and defend the principles of modernity. What would he mean by that, by saying the principles of modernity?
He is completely within this, what I would call the post-war consensus. There is a lot of talk about it today, that he is still within this idea that the individual, basically that the entire world or the entire country can be led as imagine, like as the song from John Lennon, Imagine. So no more wars, nothing to die for, no religion, no hill to die on, everything, just one big dance around the world. And so I think that is what he
But that
means with
implies a
Enlightenment
very,
values.
very authoritarian government. Huh? Such a worldview implies a very authoritarian government to organize the traffic between all these atomized individuals. You cannot have it
Yeah,
both
of
ways.
course. Of
Yeah.
course. Yeah. You need a bureaucratic state to manage all these atomized individuals. So, but yeah, I mean, what he means by Enlightenment values, I think it's a complete Hineininterpretierung. It's like a misinterpretation of, because in the Enlightenment itself, like, to be honest, these people, for example, the founding fathers and so on, they were quite elitist themselves. They were quite, I mean, they these guys were really in the classical tradition and so on. And what he is defending, I would argue, is really a 1960s form of reinterpretation of Enlightenment values. Because all these social bonds during the Enlightenment, I mean, all these social bonds still existed, and it were actually the Bolsheviks, the communists, who wanted to draw this radical Enlightenment further from the French Revolution to the Bolshevik Revolution, and they were the first to bring it to its conclusion, meaning dissolution of family, state control, everything scientifically managed, and so on and so on. And this is what conservatives should be against. So yeah, I mean, I think he is completely wrong in saying that conservatism is the working out of Enlightenment values. I think it's to make a more philosophical note about this. He doesn't understand, and Scruton does understand this, that Kant tried to make a boundary on reason to make room for culture and for religion and so on. And this is literally a quote from Immanuel Kant, is that he tries to make a boundary on what can be within reason. So there is this room for rationalism, but there are some things which exist next to it: art, the state, and so on, religion. And the only thing which Bart De Wever is recuperating, I think, from the Enlightenment is this rationalistic part. It's not the rest, because he's completely hostile to the romantic reaction to Enlightenment rationalism. So yeah, I mean, it's a very cheap. I think it's a very cheap characterization of what the
Makes
Enlightenment
no sense.
actually is.
Makes no sense. He clearly has not succeeded in any way, shape, or form in putting this theory into practice, because it's completely contradictory. It's impossible to do so. And then to say that is the best response to the challenges of our time, I think we're all waiting to see the first results, but they are wholly absent. And you can see the same with similar parties across the West. They are not succeeding in persuading people or making any meaningful difference. Now, I think we deconstructed slightly this notion of enlightened conservatism, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But how would you then define conservatism is really about? Because obviously the Enlightenment is not helping us much further. In my view, and maybe it's wrong, I just want to pick your brain on this, is that my view is that conservatism really is rooted in a much older tradition, which goes back to Plato, and a much more solid foundation, which is about community, family, religion, whereas the Enlightenment is an obsession with the self. It's more narcissistic.
If the question is, what is conservatism really about? I think that what I was talking about, that the project of Kant, trying to give rationality and reason its proper place, and not letting it flow over in the other parts of society, is a very important big part of it. For example, how what a human is, for example, is completely different than what the Enlightenment view, for example, says. A human is always bonded. You can't choose where you are born. You can't choose when you are born. You can't choose your mother tongue. You are born with communal bonds to your parents and to your siblings. So you can't choose in which kind of world you are born, contrary to the individualistic interpretation of what a human is, being an atomized individual which can break free of all different bonds. So there are a few things about human nature which aren't completely explained by this rationalistic,
Yes.
mechanistic worldview. And I think a good starting point for conservatism is to explore where what could these other things be. It is the same in epistemology, to be honest. The idea that truth is only factual, the idea that truth can only be constructed by fact, is completely wrong, in my opinion, because there are good books, for example, I don't know, Lord of the Rings from Tolkien, for example, in which there isn't any fact, but there is truth to it, truth about human nature,
I see what you mean.
truth about what the human is. And so this idea, for example, that factuality and truth are completely overlapping and corresponding isn't a specifically Enlightenment rationalist idea. And I think that conservatism really has to hit back on that and say, no, there are people who can lie by telling 1,000 little facts, and there are people who can tell the truth by telling 1,000 imaginary sentences.
Great point.
So I mean, conservatism begins with seeing how what the boundaries are of rationalism, in my opinion.
I have the impression that this enlightened worldview, this always leads to anti-humanism, and now we can see even transhumanism and the denial of what it means to be human, which is contrary to let's say, the conservative worldview, because they view this individual as an atomized being, and because you can create yourself, the denial of God.
Just as just as the laws of physics make you able to manipulate material reality around you, a progressive will also project this on humans. So we can also construct a political economy, to put it in the words of Adam Smith or Karl Marx. We can construct a political economy. We can do a science of economy to instruct our politics. So we can manipulate the social order itself and make it work according to economic laws and so on. And so I think this is I myself, I'm deeply skeptical about this project. I think it leads to social engineering. And so this is how we came into how we got the managerial society that we live in today. Organisms don't follow the same laws as mechanistic thinking. And so, societies are organic, and it has a completely different logic than the kind of mechanistic causal worldview. It's rather symbolic, it's organic, and it has its own laws. And this is really where philosophers like Spengler come into play, because they articulate this entire symbolic, organic worldview on which societies are and how societies behave. So I think that's very much against this kind of Enlightenment rationalism.
One thing that seems to be hampering, let's say, the right, is that the left is quite unified. No enemies to the left, and they operate as one block. And the left is managing to co-opt every time the so-called center-right. They operate as one uniparty, whereas the National Conservative or the conservative right is much more fragmented. How do you see this, and what could be possible solution to this fragmentation, which is hampering the march to power on the right?
I would argue that what is needed is we have to keep exposing these gatekeepers like Bart De Wever and so on. We have to expose how they fail to critique the liberal assumptions, and we should be quite thorough in raising an argument against these liberal assumptions if we want to solve few societal issues. For example, you will not be able to change our current immigration problem without addressing the liberal assumption that people are interchangeable, on which, for example, human rights are also, or the modern interpretation of human rights are founded upon. So, without critiquing these more higher order things like human rights or the free market, or all these fundamentally liberal institutions which are also institutionalized by law, without critiquing them fundamentally, we will never be able to because 60-70% of the population is done with immigration, but it is because we are not able to give a fundamental critique of why we can't change anything about this. The reason we can't change anything about this is because we have to change our assumptions about human nature and change our assumptions about human society. So yeah, I think that's our goal is keep showing the gatekeepers that they fail to give a fundamental critique to the liberal worldview, and when we ourselves have to propose another solution, that we also raise arguments which critique these liberal assumptions fundamentally. So that we say we don't want immigration, not just because there are people like people being stabbed and so on, but also because we don't believe that there is interchangeability of or universal human rights and so on. I believe a state in itself only protects the rights of its citizens, and there is no sort of universal order that grants rights to everyone. It also always has to be protected by a concrete state. So yeah, these are arguments that we have to make, fundamental arguments, if we really want to change the excesses like immigration, like the proliferation of LGBTQ and so on. We have to attack these fundamental assumptions. Yeah.
Where can people find you on the internet?
So I have a Twitter account. It's called Ervir. It's my nickname also in my student fraternity. So it's just spelled ERVIER. I also have a Substack under the same name, and those are actually the two most important channels at the time. I think they are two very powerful platforms. So yeah. Find me on Twitter.
I will link them in the show notes below. And then finally, your Jonge Wende, your publishing house. When can we expect the first results of that effort?
So yeah, we're still in the phase of actually constructing the entire business. We already have a manuscript of one book of Oswald Spengler, Preußentum und Sozialismus, is translated into Dutch. We plan on translating Ernst Jünger too, Der Krieg als inneres Erlebnis. And so there are many other books to come. For example, in the French tradition, Joseph de Maistre, de Bonald, and also in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, Carlyle, Burnham, for example. And yeah, so there is much to come, but we expect to launch in January, February, so beginning of 2026.
Excellent. Lennert, I wish you very good luck and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and have a nice day.